Je tenais d'abord à remercier le président Poutine d'avoir répondu à l'invitation que je lui avais faite il y a quelques jours lorsqu'il m'avait appelé après ma prise de fonction.
After taking office, came here in this symbolic place where today we're celebrating this 300-year anniversary, almost day of the visit of Peter the Great to France. So to better understand the secrets of a kingdom which surprised the world. And during this visit, which will last several weeks, Peter the Great spent several days in Versailles. This was the summit of arts and where he learnt about technologies with engineers, writers, archivists, which we found out that he returned to Russia with ideas and convictions and certain designs, sketches, which we will see. He was made an honorary member of the Academy of Sciences and truly modernized your country. Peter the Great is the symbol of this Russia, which wants to open itself to Europe, which wants to get from France everything and that's strong, and we have just evoked several aspects, including our exchanges, special exchanges. What's important in this story, which already lasts 300 years, is this dialogue between France and Russia, which has never ended. This dialogue between our intellectuals, our culture, which springs from a mutual respect, which lasts today, which has been helped by our great thinkers, successive thinkers, and you see the preparatory design of Peter the Great, this town which is dear to you and which makes the pride of St. Petersburg. We now find it here in this premises. This Russia, which will open itself to Europe, this French-Russian friendship, which I would like to share with you by inviting you to Versailles, and which has been the foundation of our discussion today. This history which comes before us and which has strengthened the French-Russian friendship. France has reaffirmed through its presidential elections its attachment to its independence, its engagement with Europe, and its desire to work on the destiny of the world. At stake, nothing can be tackled without dialogue with Russia. And that's why I also want to, together, evoke, as we've done during a long period, all the issues which unite our two countries. We've had the chance to see these issues with President Putin. On Syria, I reminded him of our priorities. I think we can move on this path, working together in the coming weeks. Our absolute priority is the fight against terrorism and the eradication of terrorist groups, particularly Daesh. It's the direct reason for our work in Syria, and that's why I want, through our work, through the coalition, to reinforce our partnership with Russia. Then, I would also like to organize a democratic transition, but also by keeping a Syrian state. I think that in the region, failed states are a threat to our democracies, and we've seen each time they've caused the rise of terrorist groups. So we can also there help the stability and democratic transition with two profound, deep desires that I've discussed with President Putin. The first is that red lines, extremely clear, exist on our side. The use of chemical weapons by any side. Any use of chemical weapons will lead to consequences immediately from the French side. And in terms of exchanging information and working together, sharing on the ground information. France will be vigilant so that all humanitarian access can be held to all parts of the military campaign, because it's an extremely complex situation and the civilians are the victims of sometimes our collective incapacity to save this situation. That's why in this context, I want this cooperation between our two countries be reinforced with a desire to find throughout a political solution inclusive that will allow beyond the eradication of terrorism to bring peace to Syria. In terms of the Ukrainian situation, we've spoken at length on various aspects and of putting into place a process, the Minsk process. Our desire, we can say, under the control of President Putin, is to have an exchange through the Normandy format with Ukraine, a full draw up the balance through the Normandy format to have access to a report, a detailed report from the OSCE on structural important aspects in the region. So that's a process which will take time, but both of us, we've exchanged views, and for my part, I've spoken about our desire to get to the end of this Minsk agreement of de-escalation and the consequences that this may lead to. Finally, in terms of bilateral relations, I've told President Putin the importance of several aspects, particularly our values and public opinion, the importance for France of respect of all people, of all minorities, and all the sensitivities of civil society. We've spoken of the people in LGBT community in Chechnya and in Russia. This subject, I have indicated to President Putin our expectations of France, and we've had an extremely good conversation on this. President Putin said he's taken numerous initiatives for the LGBT community in Chechnya with the aim of helping the local authorities to solve this problem. So that this corresponds to our values. More broadly, we've shared the desire to create an exchange, more intensive, more transparent between our civil societies, which should also take into account the dialogue, constructive dialogue and approach which exists between Russia and Germany to allow our youth, our economic players and cultural to have a dialogue and come closer together to solve misunderstandings, for bilateral civil society to have a Trianon dialogue, if I may call it that, looking at the exposition that we're going to look at shortly, so that our civil society, our communities of research communities and our youth, in terms of bilateral relations, effectively we hope that we can follow and even intensify these. In terms of culture, last year saw important expositions, particularly the organization of the Louis Vuitton Foundation at the Hermitage and Pushkin event. And I would like our painters, our writers, our musicians can work together in the best conditions. And for this, our culture ministers will work on this roadmap. You've seen, Mr. President, that our culture minister above all, has contributed to help numerous Russian authors, and for all those who read French, and She has helped to translate Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Pushkin, and many others. To intensify our bilateral relations also means improving our economic ties, scientific partnerships in aeronautics, in space energy, which have been developed in the last years and which have remained vigilant so that we can improve these relations in terms of financing of them between our two countries. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I wanted to remind our exchange so that both remember that history here at this gallery, this military past must never make us forget that we must not have misunderstandings, and it leads to many victims. You come from a town and country which has fought since the last century for freedom, and particularly the freedom of Europe. And through this history, our common history, through this history, coming here to Versailles, that I would like to wish that both of us can raise all issues which forge our present and history future to lead to certain results that can help us on the day-to-day. Thank you.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, on my side, I'd like to thank the President of France, to thank him for inviting me here to this wonderful place, to the palace where I've never been before. This place is certainly an incredible. It shows the history and the heritage of France in all its beauty. And I should say that this history unites us, Russia and France, and the exhibition we are to visit is going to be a testimony to that. I mean, the exhibition on the 300-year anniversary of the visit of the Russian Emperor Peter the Great to France. But I should say that was not the beginning of our relations. Our relations go deeper into the history. As you know, the intellectuals of France perfectly aware of Anna, the Queen of France, the younger daughter of our King Yaroslav the Wise. She was the wife of Henry I, and she contributed greatly to the development of France, being one of the founders of at least two European dynasties, the Bourbons and the Rois. One of the dynasties is still present in Spain, as we all know. But we today talked mostly about our bilateral relations between Russia and the European Union. We talked about the problems, about the different points of the world where we can find common grounds in settling the many problems we see. And I believe that the fundamental interests of Russia and France are more important than the current political situations and gains. And French business circles understand that perfectly. As businessmen of France continue to work in Russia, none of the around 500 French companies in the last years, and despite all the difficulties and all the restrictions, has not gone out of the Russian market. We see that our French friends are truly interested in broadening the economic ties. Last year, direct investment from France into Russian economy increased by $2.5 billion. At the same time, the bilateral circulation of goods is also on the rise. Last year, it grew by 14%, and within the last 3 months of this year by 23% already. It's true that Mr. President and I, we discussed in greater detail the humanitarian sphere and cooperation. We talked about the need to step up the students' exchange. Students should come from Russia to France and vice versa. Study and learn about the history, about the languages of our countries. I see that the administration of Mr. President know Russian language. That is something interesting. I hope they're not specialists and experts of the USSR times, but they are experts of the Russian history and Russian language as a whole. That is something very positive. I believe and I hope that we will have more people here ready to cooperate, to work with us. And this way, I hope we'll be able to discuss in detail and practically discuss things and points of mutual interest. The exhibition we are to visit, there are most valuable items from the Hermitage Museum dedicated to the visit of the Peter the Great to France. As Mr. President said, that was one of the most important points in the history between our nations. That very visit laid down the groundwork for very positive relations of our countries. We discussed the agendas, bilateral agenda, we discussed economic and humanitarian and cultural actions, and we talked about the Ukrainian crisis, and we talked about the ways to settle the Syrian crisis. Certainly, we did discuss such a dangerous situation as the Korean Peninsula nuclear problem, and that is the North Korean missile program. We are fully determined to find the ways to address this issue, not to deteriorate the situation. We coincide in what concerns the fact that the biggest task of today is to fight terrorism. Mr. President suggested that we should create a task force of a kind to have an exchange of delegations going from France to Moscow and from Moscow to France, and on practice to have cooperation against the terrorist threat, which is certainly the top priority for us and for European countries, including France. Speaking about the Syrian issue, our position is well known to everyone. I laid it out to the President of France once again. It is impossible to find the terrorist threat undermining the statehood of a country, the statehood of countries which are already feeling the scourge of inner difficulties, inner differences. But through joint efforts against terrorism, we can gain certain positive results. But results can be achieved only when we unite our efforts on practice, together fighting this peril of the 21st century. I would like to thank Mr. President for the invitation. He said that Peter the Great visited France and he spent here several weeks, but it's all reciprocal when it comes to diplomacy. So I hope Mr. President will come to Russia and will spend several weeks in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We can now take some questions.
RIA Novosti. Today we are commemorating the 300-year anniversary of establishing Russian-French relations, but within the last years we've been seeing that there is nothing positive to celebrate. So maybe now we'll have certain positive steps. You said that we are to create a humanitarian forum, and you said that there would be some anti-terrorist commission. So is it possible that other mechanisms of cooperation will also be renewed? Because we had multiple mechanisms, very efficient one. And another question, Russia is being blamed quite often that Russia interfering in elections of some countries. Many blamed Russia, and France blamed Russia for that too. So did you discuss this particular matter? Any explanations or any questions? You said that we are commemorating the 300-year anniversary of the Peter the Great's visit to France. Well, that visit was very important in terms of our relations. So that is something to celebrate, you see? you just should be willing to celebrate something, and it is much easier to find, well, a motive, a reason for that. What I would like to get across is that we should revive our economic ties. We should find common ground in what concerns the international agenda. We see that there are certain ways to cooperate, and we should try to move in the same direction together. This way, settling the problems, solving the problems that we face today. As for the alleged Russian intervention in the elections of some states, we have not discussed this, as Mr. President expressed no interest, and I don't think there is anything to discuss.
Sur votre sujet, d'abord, nous réactivons.
First of all, we've reactivated as the strategic and economic dialogue. We've also evoked, both of us, the joint working group on the Syrian crisis, and also informed the Chancellor in the coming hours of our desire for a Normandy format dialogue to advance the Minsk agreement in terms of working with the OSCE. These are concrete agreements which took place between us. As for the last French elections, we spoke about it when President Putin called to congratulate me. I'm a pragmatic person. We spoke about that. I told the president what I thought, and he told me what he thought. And we move on. What's important to me is to sort out the situation, specifically important issues raised during this news conference. So when I speak, it's not to go back on old issues.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. Hervé Asquin de l'Agence France Presse.
Agence France Presse. Mr. Putin, you've received the candidate in March, the National Front candidate, supporting tacitly at least her presidential campaign, and also had the affair of perhaps Russian allegation of Russian meddling in the French presidential elections. So I ask both of you, seeing you here next to each other, we don't have the feeling that relations between France and Russia are extremely warm, but has this meeting allowed to warm up relations at least a little? And during this meeting, in terms of human rights, have you directly raised the issue and managed to make progress on numerous issues, notably the Russian journalist Roman Soshenko? On this issue, I'll let President Putin add what he'd like to. On the first issue, it's not for me to comment on the visit of Madame Le Pen in March. It's the people of France who decide. They did not make the decision for Madame Le Pen. All the rest is just words in terms of poetry. So what happened during the campaign? I discussed during my first conversation with President Putin, neither political nor diplomatic life consists of adding personal issues. It's about solving problems to real issues that there are. So the warmth comes from the climate and our surroundings and the respect that we have for each other. And I believe it was an exchange that was extremely frank and direct, with lots of things that were said. For my part, I said everything that I thought of the various situations raised with President Putin, part of which I won't tell you because it's a question of diplomatic relations and good politics. But I believe we've said everything. So we have disagreements, but we shared them, and we see how to build in a concrete, specific way a common path, and we must build this common path, because if we don't create the conditions for doing that, we won't advance on the issues we've raised. So if we don't have a frank dialogue, sincere, which sometimes has disagreements, but which is demanding on both sides, we won't make any advances, neither on the Ukrainian or Syrian issue. In terms of human rights and various issues, we have spoken about them. In terms of the specific issues that you raised, yes, we raised them, but we won't discuss them publicly. That won't solve the issue. I'm particularly attached to having specific advances and progress and a solution which corresponds to the values that we defend and which I will not give up.
So the last part of your question about the hackers, I'd like to turn your attention to how you formulated this question, at least the interpretation that I received. So some say that it is possible that Russian hackers were involved. Well, colleague, how can we comment on such things? Some say. Who says that? Why? Maybe Russian hackers, well, maybe not. And on that basis, you draw some conclusions? Well, the press can draw conclusions, whatever conclusions you like, because that's the press. This is why the press is there. But if we speak about the world of politics, it is a road to nowhere. We should act upon the basis, and you should have the image of something only on things supported by the facts. As for Marine Le Pen coming to Russia, it's not the first time she came to Moscow. She visits Moscow regularly. And I think that her views on preserving the identity of European peoples and nations and reinforcing the sovereignty of countries is baseless. I don't think so. My position can be different from the positions of my colleagues, but I always openly express my position and my views. The second thing, that we are ready to invite and to welcome anyone at any time. If Marine Le Pen asked us to welcome her, then why should have we turned her? Why should have we refused her? Because that is something which can be positive in terms of developing our relations. It would be only strange to refuse to interact with those political figures who want to develop multifaceted relations and ties with Russia. That's the answer. It doesn't mean that we try to influence relations. It is impossible, because we are perfectly aware on what are the realities and peculiarities of French elections are. We know about the opinion polls. We knew about the opinion polls. We knew about the facts about who was the most favorable candidate for the people. And we are not children. We do serious business here. We have fundamental interests of Russian and French nations, not only political interests of some groups, and we will be guided by the interests of our countries only. Ksenia Fedorova, RT France. My question is about Syria. The situation in Syria proves that one country finds it difficult to gain certain major positive results in settling a crisis. So, is there room for cooperation between France and Russia on the way to settle the conflict? And on the follow-up, on the election campaign, Russian journalists found it a bit difficult to have an access to your campaign headquarters. So can you comment on how you are going to build your relations with the journalists of other countries?
I'll start with the second question. I've had an exemplary relationship with foreign journalists when they're journalists. And political leaders have responsibilities to say things. And when media outlets respond in an infamous way, Russia Today and Sputnik have been influential outlets which have several times have spoken mistruths about me and my campaign. And that's why they were not invited to my headquarters. All media outlets, including Russian ones, have had access to my campaign. Relationships are always the same. So it was serious that foreign media outlets interfered by saying serious mistruths during a democratic campaign, and I will not give in to that on any way. But Russia Today and Sputnik have not behaved as media outlets and journalists, but behaved as organs of influence and propaganda and false propaganda. As for the first question, I replied just now, there are clearly cooperation elements on Syria between our two countries. It's essential. I proposed to President Putin that there is strong cooperation on this subject because we have a priority, common priority, that's the fight against terrorism. It's absolutely fundamental, the priority of priorities. Secondly, I would like to exchange information to be more effective on the ground so that we can avoid the falling apart of the Syrian state and the weakening of the region, and two red lines: intransigence in terms of using chemical weapons and great demands in terms of humanitarian access. We can advance together. My hope is that winning the war against terrorism in Syria and then build together a lasting and stable peace and stable politics in Syria that will take joint work, which today we have set the foundations for.
As everyone knows, France contributes to the fight against terrorism in Syria as part of the international coalition led by the United States. As for France being independent in terms of some operations, we don't know about this because these are things settled between the allies. We aren't being informed about this one. But I think that it is more important to understand that today, during our talks, we both have felt that many things are being assessed in a similar way. Many things we see from the same angle, though there are certain disagreements too. But the things that unite us give us the reason to believe that we can not only intensify, but also to enhance the quality of our cooperation.
Thank you very much. We're going to continue our program by going to the exposition. Thank you for your attention. We had 4 questions.
Non, parce qu'il y en avait 2. Alors allez-y, les dernières.
Last question. France Inter. I'd like to go back on the question of Syria for a specific response from you on the political process. You said to G7 that Russia and Turkey and Iran are working on the Syrian question did not suit you, and that's the words that you used. In that respect, do you see a new dialogue with the Syrian state because you want to keep the state together and avoid a knockout? Would you, for example, see our embassy in Damascus? On the Ukrainian question, secondly, you've raised the Minsk process and Normandy format to start up negotiations again, but the G7 spoke about sanctions possibly against Russia, new sanctions. in this Ukraine dossier? Are those two things incompatible? On the first issue, it's evident that we need to create a framework for this diplomatic process that I raised, which I just spoke about, but I confirm to you effectively that what's been created in Astana has its merits in terms of military stabilization, cannot be enough to solve politically, diplomatically the situation long term, and cannot satisfy us in terms of the Syrian conflict, in terms of terrorist groups which hit us and are one of our main targets, and of which we've seen the consequences directly, and secondly, a large number of immigrants to Europe. And we've raised this with President Putin, a political framework and diplomatically for discussion and to build peace. And in this context, it's indispensable to be able to discuss with all the parties present. So with this process, we must start by exchanging information and areas are in common with our partners and effectively discuss with all the parties in the Syrian conflict, including the representatives of Bashar al-Assad. In terms of opening our embassy in Damascus, it's not a priority. In a certain time, we'll see how things develop. Many people are speaking about embassies, but that's not my priority. I want a roadmap diplomatically and politically that is clear to allow to build peace and stabilize this region while eradicating the terrorists. There you go. There's a lot of pragmatism behind that, and I remind you of the two demands. No weakness, firstly, in terms of chemical weapons. That's first of all. And secondly, all humanitarian access to all parts of the military conflict. That's on Syria, and that's what we'll work on in the coming months. On the issue of Ukraine, I confirm to you at this stage I have suggestions that don't exclude escalation, but that's not my hope. What I'd like is through the Minsk agreement is to find a solution, and for the Ukrainian and Russian sides, a de-escalation, taking into account all the details and situation that we've discussed. So in this context, we will, in the coming days and weeks, have a discussion in the Normandy format that will allow an evaluation, complete evaluation of the situation. And for that, we have discussed a preliminary report by the OSCE, which expresses the reality in terms of the arms at the border and the conflict zones, because the OSCE is in charge of accessing these zones and preparing reports. So in a very transparent way, that's what I want, and that's what must do to stabilize and de-escalate the situation in terms of the Minsk agreement.
And I would like to thank you for the second part of your question. You asked on the sanctions against Russia helping in some way to normalize the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine. Well, the answer is in no way. That's why I'm addressing you and the representatives of other mass media of France. Fight for the abolishment of all restrictions in global economy. Only the suspension and abolition of any restrictions, only free competition without any imposition of political instruments can allow for the development of global economy, can help you to help us to fight the lack of jobs and to better our lives. Thank you.
Well, we're finished there. Excuse me. Thank you very much. We only had 4 questions. We only agreed 4 questions. That's it. Thank you.
Merci à vous. Très bien.